1 Thessalonians 5 verse 18 tells us to give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God. Do you know, life on earth is actually so unpredictable, filled with some good and not so good moments, and it's hard to imagine how we can actually give thanks to God in all times. But God wants us to focus on His presence and His goodness and rely on His strength in the tough situations so that we don't feel overwhelmed. Now, you may have heard of one of my favourite Bible characters. His name was Daniel, the one that was thrown into the lion's den. But if you haven't heard of him, don't worry, I'll tell you more about him now. Daniel was a young man when he was captured and exiled sometime between 605 or 563 BC. The Babylonians spent years working on this young man, attempting to mould him into someone he was never created to be. But in an effort to integrate Daniel into their customs and culture, they gave him a new name and wanted him to learn their language. They even tried to change his eating habits, and in an attempt to change his lifestyle, they wanted him to serve their king. They wanted to change his identity and cause him to begin to forget the God he served, which is the God I serve. But Daniel never abandoned God, his true king, the one and only who could protect him. And the Lord miraculously kept Daniel alive despite the hard circumstances that he was facing. King Darius was the ruler over Babylon, and several men helped him govern and lead, and Daniel was one of these men. He was actually the leader of the advisors, and people knew that Daniel believed in God and followed his commands. But the other men, they didn't like it, because they didn't want him to believe in his God, and they didn't like that he was in charge of them, so they devised a plan to get rid of him. They tricked King Darius into making a new law in which people could worship and pray to only the king, and if they worshipped or prayed to other gods, they would be thrown into a den of lions. And those starving lions, well, of course, they would eat and kill the lawbreaker. So, what was Daniel going to do now? How could he respond to this new law? In Daniel 6 verse 10, it tells us that when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home, he went up to an upstairs room where the window was open towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to God just as he had done before. That's right, in an open window so everyone could see. Now Daniel understood this new law, and despite the risks that it caused, he refused to turn away from God. He continued to pray and was so thankful to God. Well, when the men saw Daniel and brought these accusations to King Darius, the king was devastated because he really favoured and he liked Daniel a lot. The king knew, though, that he could not change his laws, and Daniel now had to be thrown into that lion's den. So, when they threw Daniel into the pit of the lion's den, the king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." The next morning, the king ran to the den and called out in a very concerned voice, "Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, who you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" And Daniel responded, "Yes, my God sent an angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight." This passage goes on to tell us that when Daniel was lifted out of the den, not one wound was found on him, not one, because he had trusted in God. Then, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were thrown into the lion's den themselves and were immediately overpowered and crushed. Then King Darius issued a new decree that anyone in his kingdom must worship the living God, the God of Daniel, the God who Daniel served so well. Daniel had a close relationship with God, and he saved his life, and he helped him in these tough situations. And this was only one of the tough situations where God had helped Daniel. The story of Daniel teaches us about the promises and faithfulness of God, even when we feel helpless. Daniel refused to bow down to the king, and God used Daniel to save a nation. Thankfulness, praise, and worship to God are extremely powerful. God can help us in tough times, and He can help us fight our battles. the battles, the worries, the concerns we worry about each day.